Let's speed it up. Pancake, 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 pancake.
Well, hello out there on the internet. Welcome back to In Response, a Magic the Gathering channel focused on the rules and interactions of this game we love. My name is TS, and in this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off talking about the stack. In the last episode, we talked about what the stack is, how certain elements interact, like first in, last out. We talked about priority, how we pass priority, and how we hold priority. So, in this episode, we're going to talk more about triggers, how those get placed on the stack, how they resolve. Also, what happens when multiple triggers try to go onto the stack at the exact same time. How do we handle that? We're going to talk about split second, as well as some special circumstances like mana abilities and special actions, and how those might interact with the stack as well. So, with that in mind, let's dive on in. Now, in the last episode, we talked about having priority and putting your activated abilities and spells onto the stack. But triggered abilities work just a little bit differently. The difference between an activated and triggered ability is that an activated ability will have a cost, a colon, and then whatever the effect is for when it resolves. A triggered ability has the words when, whenever, or at the start of the ability to let you know what is the event that will cause that trigger to go on the stack, such as when you attack, whenever you draw a card, at the beginning of your end step. These are some common things that you may see for triggered abilities. Now, unlike activated abilities, a player does not have to wait until they receive priority for their trigger to go onto the stack. What happens is the game sees the triggering event, and then immediately after the next time state-based actions is checked to clean up the board, all relevant triggers will go onto the stack. Now, when only a single trigger goes onto the stack, that's pretty easy to resolve. All players have to pass priority on it, and it's otherwise treated exactly like any activated ability or spell. Once it's on the stack, it can be responded to. But what happens when we have multiple triggers trying to go onto the stack at the same time? Well, that's going to depend on two things. One, it's going to depend on who controls the triggers, and it's going to depend on whose turn it is, who is the active player. So what happens if a single player has more than one trigger trying to go onto the stack at the exact same time? Let's look at a situation that might happen. I'm the active player, it's my turn, and I have a Garruk's Uprising in play. Garruk's Uprising has a trigger that says when I have a creature with power 4 or greater enter the battlefield, I draw a card. Most of the time that's pretty straightforward. I have a creature enter, I draw a card. Single trigger on the stack, single resolution, no problem. But let's complicate it just a little bit. If I have a Galta Stampede Tyrant enter the battlefield, now I have Garruk's Uprising triggering to draw me a card, but at the same time, I have Galta with its own Enter the Battlefield trigger telling me that I can put creatures from my hand directly into play. So, do I resolve that first, or do I resolve the card draw first? Which might matter, because if I draw a creature, that's another creature Galta gets to put into play. Well, since I control both of those triggers that are trying to happen at the same time, I get to decide the order they go onto the stack. So what I would probably do is put the Galta trigger onto the stack first, and then put the Garruk's Uprising trigger on the stack on top of that. Because then we use first in, last out, so the Galta trigger will resolve last, meaning that I draw a card from Garruk's Uprising first, potentially getting me another creature in hand to put into play off of the Galta trigger as that resolves. So when one player controls multiple triggers that go on the stack at the same time, that seems pretty easy to shake out. But if we're not complicating things, are we even playing Magic? Let's look at another scenario here. What if I have multiple triggers trying to happen at the same time, and my opponent has multiple triggers that all try to happen at the same time because of the exact same event? Do mine get to resolve first? Do theirs get to resolve first? Do they somehow weave within each other and resolve mine then theirs, then mine then theirs? So here's how that's going to shake out. Let's look at an example. I have an impact tremors in play that says whenever I have a creature enter, I deal 1 damage to each of my opponents. My opponent has a Soul Warden in play that says whenever any creature enters the battlefield, they gain life. So if I have 5 token creatures all enter the battlefield at the exact same time, do I deal my damage first, or do they gain their life first? And this may matter if their life is low enough that they would die if they didn't gain their life first. So what happens is this is going to depend on whose turn it is, and we use what's called active player, non-active player order. So all of my triggers will go onto the stack, and if they're different triggers or if it matters about the order, I place all of my triggers onto the stack in whatever order I choose. Then, on top of that, my opponent puts all of their triggers onto the stack. And again, if they're different triggers, if it matters what order it is, they will get to decide what order their triggers go onto the stack on top of mine. So in this case, they will gain 5 life, 1 for each of their Soul Warden triggers, before I get to deal 5 damage to them, 1 for each of my Impact Tremor triggers. And ultimately that could matter a lot depending on their current life total before this all resolves. Well, it's time to tackle the big question. How do we do this in a multiplayer game where there are at least 3 people sitting at the table? One of the most popular formats right now in the game is generally played with 4 people, so this is something that could come up pretty often. Well, it's not as complicated as it may seem once you understand how this concept works in a 1 versus 1 format. We just apply that with extra players. So the active player, let's say player 1, has their triggers go onto the stack first. Then we move in turn order to the next non-active player, which is player 2. They put their triggers onto the stack next, then player 3 does it, and then player 4 does it, if all of their triggers are trying to happen at the same time. Then we simply resolve it in the reverse order. Whatever was the last to go on is the first one to get resolved. So player 4 resolves their triggers in order, then player 3 resolves their triggers, then player 2, and then player 1. So ultimately it works exactly like the 1 versus 1 version. It's just that we're adding those extra non-active players. Now, with each topic we cover, it truly is impossible to go over every single scenario that may come up, and the stack is no different. There's going to be some things that we will have to go back over as we talk about more specific situations in the future. But there are just a couple other things that I want to address here in this episode. The first of those is called Split Second. This is an ability found on some spells, and it'll say so on the card itself. Split Second means that while this spell is on the stack, no player, even when they get priority, no player is able to cast a spell or activate any ability that will be put onto the stack. So while that split second spell is on the stack, it is almost impossible to interact with or respond to. There's a couple of exceptions that we'll go over in just a minute. So let's look at an example of how split second is going to affect the stack. In this example, my opponent has a Rhystic Study in play, so every time I cast a spell, they ask me if I want to pay 1 mana as part of the Rhystic Study trigger, and if I don't pay that extra mana, they get to draw a card. This is pretty annoying throughout the game. Either I have to pay extra for my spells, or they just get free value from me taking actions. I'm tired of them doing that, so what I'm going to do is try to destroy that Rhystic Study, but I suspect they have a counterspell in their hand, some way to stop me from casting a spell that would destroy their Rhystic Study. Well, fortunately for me, I have a Krosan Grip. Krosan Grip has split second. That means that from the moment I put Krosan Grip onto the stack, my opponent, or myself even, is unable to activate anything or cast a spell that will go onto the stack, which means my opponent's counterspell will not save their Rhystic Study. Now, an important detail here is to note that while we cannot activate abilities or cast spells while split second is on the stack, triggered abilities can still happen. So, in the example, when I cast that Krosan Grip, my opponent's Rhystic Study still saw that I cast a spell, and its triggered ability will ask me if I want to pay a mana, and if I don't, my opponent still gets to draw a card as part of that trigger resolving. And finally, one other thing about split second that I've seen many players misunderstand and unfortunately play this the wrong way is they believe split second protects the entire stack. So for example, in the last episode we talked about holding priority in order to put multiple activated abilities or spells onto the stack. So you can cast a sorcery such as Blasphemous Act, hold priority, put an instant on the stack above it, like Krosan Grip. Krosan Grip, while it's on the stack, will have split second. So while Krosan Grip is on the stack, your opponent cannot counterspell your Blasphemous Act. But once Krosan Grip leaves the stack, once it resolves, now Blasphemous Act still has to have priority passed around all players before it's allowed to resolve. It's at this time that your opponent can respond with a counterspell, because split second is no longer a part of the stack. So finally, as we talk about what uses the stack and how they use the stack, I think we need to talk, at least briefly, about two things that do not use the stack. These are mana abilities, which we've already mentioned before is an ability, whether activated or triggered, that produces mana, does not target anything, and is not a loyalty ability of a planeswalker. So, for example, when you tap a land for mana, or if you have a creature, artifact, or some other permanent that you activate to create mana, or if you have something that triggers to create mana when something else happens. These are mana abilities. They do not use the stack. They cannot be responded to. although you must still have priority in order to activate activated mana abilities. And the last thing that I want to touch on just briefly is special actions. This is something we'll go into more detail about in a later episode, but I want you to be able to recognize the difference between an activated ability and a special action. It can be a little tricky. The main difference is that next to the cost for a special action, there is no colon. So an activated ability will have a cost, a colon, and then the effect. A special action will just have the cost and what it does. So, for example, a morph creature that can be turned face up is going to show the cost for the special action of turning it face up. That special action, you have to have priority to do it, but it does not use the stack. It cannot be responded to, and you can use that special action even if split second is on the stack. Now, if that special action causes a triggered ability, so for example, most morph creatures are going to have a trigger that begins with the word when. When this creature is turned face up, and then it will say what the effect is when that trigger resolves. So, although turning that morph creature face up was a special action that did not use the stack, and one that nobody was able to respond to, the resulting trigger now goes onto the stack normally and acts like any other triggered ability that gets put onto the stack. That means it can be responded to. Well, we made it, and while there may be specific scenarios that come up down the road, I feel like we have a pretty solid foundation of what the stack is and how we interact with it. So, in the next episode, we're going to talk about abilities. We're going to talk about the difference between a static effect, an activated ability, a triggered ability, a replacement effect, and characteristic defining abilities. So until then, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Look what I can do.
Oh, gee.
Oh, you're so active.